Well, here we are. We are at the end, and what I wanted to do is to just kind of give a brief overview, as brief as I can be anyway, overview of kind of where we've been. I'll have greater detail on Canvas about what I actually expect of you for the final team quiz. So this is really kind of a high level assessment of the semester. So we started off thinking about the definition of economics, and we had a couple of more sort of nuts and bolts definitions. But this one from Alfred Marshall is always a winner, which is economics is really at its core the study of mankind. So we might say now person kind in the ordinary business of life. So, what does that mean? That means that we are looking at a social science that describes the way in which economic agents are allocating their scarce resources among competing and unlimited wants. And in this, we focused throughout the semester on thinking about opportunity cost. We focused particularly about about benefits and costs at the margins. So there were a number of places in which we had sort of a rational rule of decision making about one thing and another. And sort of obliquely, but part of the skill set of being an economist is to also think about the unintended consequences. So if we go down a path of a certain direction, what's going to happen in terms of people's behaviors? How do decisions that we make, say, particularly with respect to policy, affect trade offs? So thinking about opportunity cost as well as thinking about trade offs. And in relation to this, our first model where we put kind of all of this stuff together is, and that is foundational for thinking like an economist, is a demand and supply model. And so, if nothing else from this semester, if you walk away with an understanding of the underpinnings of demand and supply, marginal benefits, marginal cost, evaluating an equilibrium, and thinking about the way an equilibrium both is achieved and will change in response to demand and supply curves, that's an excellent start. So, what kinds of things did we talk about this semester? Well, in the context of demand and supply, as well as later on with macroeconomic topics, we thought about how do markets work. We thought about the sense in which they work well and in cases in which they fail. And in this, we also talked about the difference between efficient allocations of resources and to some degree equitable allocations of resources. We thought about why markets might not work well. So, why are there sources of market failure? Things like not perfectly competitive markets because of monopolies, single sellers or single sellers, monopsonies, or because of information problems in the market. So, we talked about those kinds of things early on. In the macroeconomic context, as we shifted, we talked about measurement issues. So we defined gross domestic product, inflation, unemployment, full employment, potential gross domestic product, real and nominal gross domestic product. And we thought about how we measure those kinds of macroeconomic variables. When we transitioned ultimately into the material that was in chapters 18 through 20, our focus was on what causes business fluctuations, business cycle fluctuations, maybe we put in here. So this was, again, the chapter 18 through 20 material, especially where we modeled with an IS, MP, and Phillips curve framework the various kinds of ways in which shocks, either demand shocks or policy changes or supply side shocks, could affect the macroeconomic outcome in the short run. In the most recent set of notes, we've talked about what kinds of things determine our standard of living, or in the words of Adam Smith, the wealth of nations. So we talked about the determinants of labor productivity because of that being correlated with per capita real gross domestic product, which itself is a measure of income per person and a proxy for our overall well-being. And so we spent a fair amount of time discussing those kinds of things. And throughout this, we talked both for the macroeconomy in the short run, in the 18 through 20 material, as well as in the longer run stuff. What is the role of government? In what ways can government make the outcome that occurs through the normal workings of a market better? And worse, but we tend to focus on the positive, better. We have three kind of big important lessons in macroeconomics. The first is what we've dealt with most recently. In the long run, a country's capacity to produce goods and services determines the standard of living of its citizens. That is going to be influenced by both the level of savings and investment, which has corollaries, of course, to an investment in both physical capital as well as human capital, but then has corollaries to fiscal policy to the extent that fiscal policy or monetary policy can affect the overall decisions about savings and investment in the macroeconomy. So those things are going to affect standards of living. And we talked about the important role of technological progress. And again, the ways in which government can assist in enhancing the level of innovation that happens in an economy. In the short run, the second big lesson is that in the short run, aggregate spending influences the amount of goods and services that an economy produces. So again, this is the ISMP PC model, the Fed model, if you will. And what we were focusing on in particular is that as consumption or investment or government expenditures or net exports change, so as these change, then this changes spending. Or excuse me, changes, that is spending, changes production in the macroeconomy. And so one of the principal driver of thinking about short run fluctuations was what kinds of things will affect aggregate spending. And then we used this model, of course, to talk about how the output gap changes in the short run in response to either these kind of spending changes directly or inadvertently through, say, shocks in the financial system, or perhaps things happening in the Phillips curve world. And then finally, in the short run, we noted that policymakers who control monetary and fiscal policy face a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this is particularly if we think about fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is going to involve, of course, changes in government expenditures or changes in taxes, and that's going to lead directly to a shift in the IS curve. And monetary policy is going to be associated with a shift in the MP curve. So this MP is monetary policy. Shifts the MP curve. And when either of these change, then there's going to be a change in the output gap and demand pull inflation as a result. So when there is demand pull inflation, that gives rise to unexpected inflation, and as a result, then the actual rate of inflation is going to be different than what was expected. And in particular, we can go a little bit further and say that if there is, say, the IS curve shifts right, or the MP curve shifts down, then this is going to lead to a more positive output gap. It's going to imply a decrease in unemployment, but demand pull inflation. That raises the overall rate of inflation, and then vice versa. If the IS curve shifts left or the MP curve shifts up, then we're going to see a less positive output gap, an increase in the amount of unemployment, but a decrease in the overall level of inflation in the macroeconomy. So this is what we mean by that trade-off existing. There are a lot of challenging questions that sort of excitedly, if you're considering studying economics, remain unresolved and are certainly important kind of big things to be thinking about. So one of these is, can and should policymakers try to stabilize the macroeconomy? A second big question is, how should policymakers try to promote growth in the economy's level of potential real GDP? Third and fourth, how big of a problem are government budget deficits and the debt? And how costly is inflation? And if we need to bring it down, how costly is it to reduce it? So this is in context to, in the textbook, you can refer to the Volcker disinflation periods in the early 1980s with and the ensuing recessions. And then, always looking forward, is today different? What are the particular headwinds that need to be recognized and reconciled for the 21st century? So what I'd like to do is just take a little bit of time and think about each one of these questions. So can and should policymakers try to stabilize the macroeconomy? Well, in this context, we talked about the idea of forecasting, um, potentially errors, incomplete information that make it difficult in real life to think about, what kind of expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy we should apply. And we've kind of been naive, perhaps, about the degree to which we can sort of effortlessly control the IS and MP curves to achieve a particular outcome. Of course, in real life, that's a lot more sloppy. We don't know with great precision about the size of the multipliers and that certainly is going to matter. We could, ask how big that is. And similarly, we don't know about lags. What is the sort of, how long are they? In fact, we talked about monetary policies maybe affecting the macroeconomy over 6 to 18 months time span. That's a pretty big gap, and so it's good to try to think about this. We have a mitigating factor for these in the form of automatic stabilizers. But not everything in the macroeconomy is on cruise control. So discretionary, even though we have automatic stabilizers, discretionary policy choices need to be made sometimes at challenging time periods, like now. So trying to think about how to respond to the effects of the COVID pandemic on the macroeconomy. All of this is going to, of course, make the conduct of monetary policy difficult and fiscal policy. So makes the conduct of policy difficult. And while we haven't seen this in the US economy, it's recently, certainly could be the case that rather than having policy be stabilizing, it could be destabilizing for the macroeconomy, meaning that the wrong amount of, say, fiscal or monetary policy is put in place, and it's put in place too late, and so the economy is naturally kind of tending back to an equilibrium, and this just makes it worse. Related to this is this question of if we're going to use stabilization policies like monetary policy or fiscal policy. We spent a fair amount of time thinking about the difference between using rules or fully discretionary policy. If I had to be fair, I think probably the majority of economists land on this tactic of discretionary, at least in the US. But that's because we have, for the most part, at least with monetary policy, fairly credible institutions. And so this is this decision about whether we need rules or discretion points to the importance of credibility, believability in the conduct of policy. In terms of other questions, we have, how should policymakers try to promote growth in the economy's level of potential gross domestic product? So the first question is focusing on the short run. This question is asking about the long run. So you will recall that our objective is to increase real GDP per capita because this, as a measure of standard of living, is correlated with measures that, in general, measures of improvements in well-being. And so subject to the difficulties in terms of measuring correctly what we want in the terms of well-being by what we do with gross domestic product, we also noted that we could think about real GDP per capita as being this, and if we write this over, we saw that this is in the way in which we defined this. And so we can put in here abstracting from human capital. So not to ignore it, not to minimize its importance, but just this was our notation. So we noted that, of course, this has a important but somewhat limited role in long run improvements in standards of living. We talked about increasing capital per worker, so we talked about the role of savings. And we can as well think about in here, if we're going to think about sort of capital, particularly physical capital, is it better to have it coming from the private sector or from the public sector? Or a blend of both, of course. And so when we think about public capital projects, when the government builds roads, or if we want to talk about human capital, contributes to education, these are things that are forms of government spending, but have an investment-like component to them. So these are important considerations in terms of how we think about economic growth. We noticed as well that increases in capital per worker through higher savings or other mechanisms will cause temporarily faster growth, but sustained improvements in standards of living. So this Y over population, and Y over L, require technological, requires technological progress, meaning sustained increases in this A parameter. And so with that, then we needed to think about, what are things that governments can do? There are suggestions that have been made, and certainly the importance of protecting intellectual property and basic research are important. But going along with this, we need to ask, whether there are budgetary consequences to tax cuts or spending increases that would offset some of the good things that we're talking about in this context. So there are a lot of difficult things to grapple with when we're thinking about increasing the long run capacity of the economy to produce goods and services. We talked as well about supply side spending policies and supply side tax changes, and that has its own sort of problems and issues as we have identified earlier. When we talk about budget deficits and debts, how big of a problem are they? Of course, we highlighted the idea of crowding out. And this is the idea that if we have bigger budget deficits, that'll translate into less savings by the government and an increase in longer term interest rates and a reduction in private sector spending. We also talked about the idea that increase debts to GDP can spark crises of confidence or full-blown debt crises. Now, on the other hand, of course, we also pointed out several counter arguments. One of the most the biggest one, of course, is that if it is the case that these budget deficits are arising because of the fact that we're spending on things that are going to increase the size of the pie, the long run economic pie. So either the government is spending on, say, infrastructure projects, or there are tax cuts that enhance capital spending in the macroeconomy, then this may not portend such a large problem for budget deficits, because we'll be able to have a bigger economy and therefore be able to support a larger budget deficit. We also, in this context, let's see, that's, sorry, that's probably good enough in terms of what we talked about. So just to round this out, will government spending or decreases in taxes increase potential GDP? To the extent that they do, then budget deficits and debts are less of a concern. And then with inflation, when we talked about inflation, we talked about the cost of inflation as being several-fold. So we talked about menu costs, we talked about shoe leather costs, and we talked about unanticipated redistribution of interest income, but income between borrowers and lenders, and the consequences, the adverse consequences that can happen in financial markets as a result of that. These costs exist, but it's an open question as to how severe they are for a non-hyperinflationary economy like the U.S. Again, if you're curious, you can go back into the textbook and read the description about the US's experience in trying to reduce inflation in the economy in an era in which monetary policy was not viewed as being particularly credible. But again, in these days and times, uh, we think about the credibility of certainly the central bank as being important. These days, we have a lot of experience with forward guidance in terms of the Fed telling people as clearly as it possibly can about what's going to happen in the future so that that gets incorporated into decision makings. And so the bottom line of this is that the magnitude and the costs of inflation and disinflation remain open to debate. Um, and sometimes this just makes it very tricky in terms of evaluating what next steps should be done. And then finally, we have a number of things that just represent significant challenges for the US and perhaps other economies going forward. So, for the US, we've talked about the idea of forward guidance and quantitative easing as being options for the conduct of monetary policy when interest rates are at their zero lower bound. However, it's not known right now kind of the extent to which we can rely on those types of monetary policy tools. Forward guidance seems like something that can be very productive, but we just simply don't know because there isn't a lot of experience with it in terms of understanding the limits, if there are any, of quantitative easing and what the consequences are of having protracted periods of time as we are these days with interest rates that are very, very low by historical standards. Another problem that has seemed like it was going to turn around, but then with the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, is the problem of unemployment and labor force participation, and going along with that, to some degree, stagnation in earnings. So there were upticks in earnings that were largely attributed to pandemic related policies, but as those expire, it's not clear. What's going to happen. And to the extent that that's a problem, we are going to see potentially worsening of inequality. So we've talked particularly, and you've kind of seen me perhaps hesitate in the way in which I spoke about this, of of say um, say income per capita. Let's see. Um, Looking at income per capita, but not saying anything more. But this is an average, right? So just because income on average per person is rising doesn't mean that that's actually the lived experience of people in the economy. So it's not sufficient, even though that's our starting point. If we had, 2 semesters or 3 semesters together, probably from your point of view, heaven forbid, but if we had more time together, we would have taken more time to focus on more than just increasing GDP per capita. We need to consider these distributional effects, and thinking about what's happening at the average is not sufficient for thinking about these very tricky problems of inequality. Going along with this is, going along with this are problems related to educational outcomes and unequal access to quality education. This is certainly something that in the long run can influence GDP per person on average, as well as just looking at a more microeconomic level. We have demographic concerns and implications for the national debt that we've talked about. lurking behind the scenes, but certainly something that is on my mind a lot is the problem of climate change and consequences if there if and when these might occur of ecological overload. So I am optimistic that policymakers and smart people in your generation in particular are not just focusing on growth for growth's sake, but looking at technological ways in which we can grow in a more sustainable fashion. But it's still the case that these are serious problems that we need to think about. There's always the trade off of relying on markets in terms of efficiency, which is great, but is it the case that we're dividing the pie, if you will, in an equitable fashion? This, of course, is a value judgment. It's something that is normative, not positive. And if you were interested in this, you could look through, I think it's chapter 8, for lots of different possible ways to think about equity. Again, if we had had, a couple more weeks together, we would have gone through the material in that chapter and kind of thought about different ways in which we might frame the problem of equity, and particularly in contrast to efficiency considerations. Related to this is, if we're thinking about the role of markets, it's often the case that either we have the private workings of the market or some kind of authority and intervention in the market by government. So the division of power and authority into government and private sectors is a source of strength of capitalism. But that isn't to say that we should just go all free markets with no regulation and no oversight. There is a positive role, at least in my estimation. So here's my value judgment. There is a big positive role that government can play, but it is an open question as to where that boundary is and thinking about what the proper role and scope of government is and size of government. So certainly there are people who would advocate a very, very large role for government, and we just need to be aware of what those trade-offs are. There is without empirical estimation, no sort of right answer. And what you agree or what you think of is great. That is your judgment. So why do we study economics? I think that what economics does is it helps you understand the world in which you live. It forces you to kind of think systematically about benefits and costs and help you be a more astute participant in markets and in the economy. And it'll give you a better, or hopefully it has already given you a better understanding of the potential for and the limits of economic policy. And that'll be important. As you continue, hopefully, your role as a voter and a leader in the upcoming century. So I always like this quote by Greg Mankiw, who's a professor at Harvard. Came from his principles, his introductory textbook, and it's for a lot of people as you talk to econ practitioners why they got into economics. They like the combination of politics and science that's embodied in this discipline, and it brings these two things together with questions of politics and tries to make a positive impact on the world in which we live. So why study economics? Because it's fun. So where might you go from here? I have, of course, a number of things that I've alluded to over the years. If you hang out on Twitter, so I have to say I've been on the TikTok and not sure I can wrap my head around it, but Twitter I get. And so here are some things. Certainly, you could follow Econ Twitter, and then these people have interesting lists that they follow as well. I am a big podcast fan. These are podcasts that I'm listening to every single week, and are ones that I would recommend to you. And then what follows here is a number of books. So if you wanted to read something over break or after break, what might you do? Well, you might, in fact, go with any of these particular books. So, I want to say thank you. This has been a challenging semester, and I wish you the best as you round out not only this class but also your others. And I look forward very, very much to seeing your class projects.